First, cost of living, and some members, I think Mr. Nicholas Fang and Associate Professor Eugene Tan have mentioned the latest EIU report, which ranked Singapore the most expensive city in the world. And I know this is floating around and it's attracting a lot of attention, but I don't particularly want to focus on this report in its own right, but to explain a couple of very basic things about the reports that will come out from time to time, whether it's EIU or Mercer, which are really aimed at measuring expatriate costs of living in different parts of the world. And they're useful tools for HR managers and corporate HQs as they decide where to place their people, and even when they're placing them in a particular place, how to compensate them adequately based on the cost of living. It's a useful tool. But these are basically aimed at comparing costs of living for expatriates in different cities or different countries in the world. And what this means, therefore, is two things make an important difference in these surveys, and two things in these surveys are quite different from the factors that affect the cost of living for locals, for Singaporeans. Quite different. First, currency. An important reason why, in fact, we have become an expensive place for expatriates is the Singapore dollar has strengthened. And indeed, the EIU report points this out. Singapore dollar has strengthened over the years, particularly in recent years, and it means it's a more expensive place for someone who's paid in a foreign currency or for a corporate HQ abroad whose earnings are in foreign currency. As the Singapore dollar strengthens, it becomes more expensive. But the reverse is true for Singaporeans. The stronger Singapore dollar improves purchasing power. The stronger Singapore dollar improves purchasing power both in Singapore because imported goods become cheaper, and for us, food and everyday items are all largely imported. Secondly, it improves purchasing power even when Singaporeans go abroad, and you can see that from the latest travel fair last week. So a stronger Singapore dollar, not sudden sharp appreciation, but steady appreciation, has been good for Singaporeans, but it does mean it becomes a more expensive place for expatriates. Second important difference has to do with what goods and services are being measured as part of the cost of living basket in these surveys. And the EIU consumption basket, I wouldn't knock it. It's it's inevitably subjective, but they're trying to put together a basket of what they think are expatriate costs, perhaps a little on the high end, but expatriate costs. And it's quite different from the goods and services consumed by ordinary Singaporeans, which our CPI basket, for instance, measures. So, for example, the EIU basket includes imported cheese, filet mignon. I'm not sure which restaurant that is, but filet mignon, Burberry-type raincoats. Burberry-type raincoats, not very common in Singapore, I think, but Burberry-type raincoats. And I, of course, know very little about this. I mean, it's, 4 best seats in a theater, 3-course dinners at high-end restaurants for 4 people. These are items in the cost of living basket, right? And I don't think they're irrelevant to an expatriate cost of living basket, but it's quite different from a cost of living basket for Singaporeans. And indeed, for some of these items, Singapore is expensive. Transport is also part of the cost of living basket for these expatriate indexes, but no public transport. It's just cars and taxis. And our public transport, as you know, is in fact significantly cheaper than most other cities, New York, London, Tokyo. We are about comparable to Hong Kong, but significantly cheaper than most other cities. Even our taxi fares are cheaper. But our cars are expensive because we are small. So for an expatriate, if you want to own a car, it is expensive in Singapore. But if you're talking about an average Singaporean taking public transport, it is in fact much cheaper than many other cities. So I highlight this just to point out the differences. It's not that these surveys are wrong. It's not that they are misguided. They're measuring something quite different from the cost of living for an ordinary local in different cities around the world. Now, there are in fact, unfortunately, not very many surveys that truly try to measure the cost of living for ordinary residents. But we have a very good study that was done by the Asian Competitiveness Institute in 2012, which compared purchasing power in different cities. And they specifically distinguish the cost of living for expatriates and the cost of living for a typical resident household. And they looked at all sources of data, including the ERU study, World Bank's International Comparisons Program, and they constructed consumption baskets for expatriates and for ordinary residents. And they found that Singapore was indeed quite expensive for expatriates compared to other cities. At the time of their study, Singapore was ranked fifth out of 109 cities in the index for expatriates. But costs for Singapore residents were very different. We were ranked 61st out of the 109 cities when you compare the cost of living for residents. Quite similar to other Asian cities like Hong Kong, which was ranked 58, or Seoul, that was ranked 60th. So that's the basic difference. And from time to time, these surveys will come up. I know some people will give it a spin, but it's measuring something quite different from the cost of living for our residents. What is important for us is that Singaporeans, and particularly lower and middle income Singaporeans, have incomes that grow faster than the cost of living. That's what's important. And in fact, that's what we have fortunately been able to achieve. In the last 5 years alone, if you take our middle income households, our median households, their incomes have gone up faster than the CPI index, than the cost of living. In fact, it's gone up by about 10% in real terms. Similar rate of growth for the low income household, about 10% in real terms. And indeed, for the low income household, if you exclude from the CPI index imputed rentals for those who are in fact owning their homes and they don't have to pay rentals, if you exclude that factor, then actually the increase in real incomes of the 20th percentile was 19% over the last 5 years. So significant improvement, and we keep our eyes focused on that. Keep our eyes focused on how the average Singaporean and the low-income Singaporean is doing in their incomes relative to the cost of living.